The glass doors of Ridgemont Federal Bank swung open on a Tuesday morning in late October, and every head in the lobby turned toward the man who stepped inside. Garrett Nolan stood 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a faded denim jacket that still carried traces of pipe sealant from the job he had left an hour ago. His work boots left faint marks on the polished marble floor. Beside him, holding his hand with both of hers, was his 6-year-old daughter Rosie, her backpack covered in butterfly patches. Garrett walked to the nearest teller window, set a manila envelope on the counter, and said in a calm, steady voice that he needed to make a wire transfer of $8 million. The teller blinked twice. From behind the glass wall of the corner office, Preston Marsh rose from his leather chair, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked into the lobby with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He placed a hand on Garrett's shoulder as though steadying a confused tourist and said, loud enough for 3 employees to hear, "$8 million? Maybe you mean 8,000? The lobby went silent. Rosie looked up at her father and squeezed his hand tighter. Garrett said nothing. He simply held Preston's gaze until the bank manager removed his hand and gestured toward the consultation room at the end of the hall. The consultation room was small and overly air-conditioned, with a single window overlooking the parking lot and framed prints of mountain landscapes on the walls that no one had ever looked at twice. Preston sat behind a mahogany desk that seemed designed to remind visitors who held the authority in this building. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one ankle over the other knee, and studied Garrett the way a man might study a stain on an expensive rug. Garrett lowered Rosie into the chair beside him, unzipped his jacket, and opened the manila envelope. Inside were notarized documents from a Houston-based estate attorney, a certified death certificate, a probate court order, and a letter of instruction authorizing the transfer of $8,200,000 from the estate of Walter Eugene Nolan to the account of Garrett James Nolan at Ridgemont Federal Bank. Preston picked up the first page between 2 fingers as though it might be contagious. He scanned it briefly, set it down, and folded his hands. And where exactly did this money come from, Mr. Nolan? Garrett explained. His grandfather, Walter Nolan, had been a petroleum engineer in Galveston, Texas. He had worked for 41 years in the oil fields along the Gulf Coast, living in a 1,200-square-foot house with a patched roof and a Ford truck older than Garrett himself. Walter had never bought a new car, never taken a vacation beyond the Louisiana border, and never once mentioned to anyone outside his attorney that he had accumulated a fortune through decades of careful investments and mineral rights royalties. He had passed away 6 months earlier, quietly, in his sleep, at the age of 89. The will had been straightforward. Everything went to Garrett. Preston listened with the expression of a man humoring a child's story about a dragon in the backyard. He asked whether the documents had been verified by a notary. Garrett said yes. They were notarized on every page. Preston asked why Garrett had chosen this particular branch rather than a bank in Texas. Garrett said he lived here, in Ridgemont, and this had been his bank for 11 years. Preston asked whether Garrett had considered the possibility that the documents might contain errors. Garrett said his grandfather's attorney had handled estates worth considerably more than this one, and there were no errors. Throughout the conversation, Rosie sat in the oversized leather chair, her legs dangling a full foot above the floor. She had found a blank deposit slip on the edge of Preston's desk and was drawing on it with a crayon from her backpack. She drew a small house with a triangular roof, and inside the house she drew 2 figures, one tall, one short. There was no third figure. There had not been a third figure in any of Rosie's drawings for 3 years, not since her mother's funeral, when Garrett had held her on his lap in the front pew and she had asked, in a voice loud enough for the entire church to hear, when Mommy was coming back from the long nap. Preston cleared his throat and straightened the already straight stack of papers on his desk. Look, Mr. Nolan, I'm sure you understand when someone walks in off the street with paperwork claiming $8 million, we have a responsibility to be thorough. He emphasized the words off the street as if Garrett had crawled through a window rather than walked through a door that was open to the public. "I'll need to run this through our compliance team. It's standard. In the meantime, what kind of work do you do, if you don't mind my asking?" "I'm a plumber," Garrett said. Preston nodded slowly, his eyes drifting downward to Garrett's boots, to the grease stain on his right sleeve, to the calloused knuckles resting on the armrest. The nod was the kind that said everything the mouth would not. "Right," he said. "A plumber." He stood and buttoned his suit jacket with a deliberate smoothness, as though preparing to leave a stage. "Give me a few minutes. I need to verify a couple of things with my team." Preston stepped out of the consultation room and closed the door behind him with a soft click. He did not go to the compliance office. He did not consult anyone in risk management. Instead, he walked to the center of the lobby, where two senior tellers, Margaret and Kevin, stood behind the counter sorting deposit slips. Preston leaned against the counter, lowered his voice just enough to seem confidential but not enough to avoid being heard by the 4 employees within earshot. "Heads up," he said. "Guy in room B claims he's sitting on $8 million, walked in wearing work boots and a jacket that smells like a hardware store." He let the image settle before continuing. "I've seen this before. Could be forged documents, could be some kind of inheritance scam. Either way, keep security close and don't process anything until I give the word. Last thing we need is a scene." Margaret glanced toward the consultation room with a look that hovered between concern and obedience. Kevin shifted uncomfortably and pretended to count a stack of 20s he had already counted. Near the far end of the counter, a young teller named Dana Reeves looked up from her keyboard. She had been at Ridgemont Federal for 11 months, long enough to have seen Preston dismiss 4 other customers in a similar fashion: an elderly woman with a cashier's check, a young couple whose mortgage application had been questioned until they left, a veteran whose pension transfer had been delayed without cause. Each time, the pattern was identical: suspicion first, service second, and only if the customer's appearance met Preston's unspoken standard. Dana said nothing. She wanted to, but Preston signed her performance reviews, and she had rent due on Friday. Inside the consultation room, Rosie tugged on Garrett's sleeve. "Daddy, why is that man being mean to you?" Garrett looked down at his daughter. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the particular confusion of a child who has been taught that politeness is a rule and cannot understand why an adult would choose to break it. He smoothed the hair from her forehead and smiled the way he always smiled at her, as though she were the only thing in any room that mattered. "He's not being mean, Rosie. He just doesn't know us yet." Rosie considered this for a moment, tilting her head the way she did when she was weighing an idea she was not entirely convinced by. Then she returned to her drawing. She added a bright yellow sun above the house and a row of red flowers along the bottom edge of the paper. Garrett watched her, and for a brief moment, the $8 million, the paperwork, the man in the expensive suit, all of it receded like the tide pulling back from shore. There was only Rosie, her crayons, and the quiet sound of wax on paper. What neither Garrett nor Preston knew was that the bank's surveillance system was being monitored at that very moment by someone who had not yet entered the building. In the parking lot, sitting in a dark gray sedan with the engine still running, Vivian Mercer held a tablet in her lap. On the screen was a live feed from 4 interior cameras: the lobby, the teller counter, the hallway, and the consultation room. Vivian was the regional director of Ridgemont Federal's Southeastern Division, responsible for 14 branches across 3 states. She had driven 2 hours that morning from the regional headquarters in Charlotte for an unannounced audit triggered by a pattern of customer complaints that had been escalating for 6 months. 7 formal complaints in the last quarter alone, 4 of them using the same phrase, "made to feel unwelcome." She watched Preston lean against the counter and whisper to his employees. She watched the body language of the tellers, the discomfort, the averted eyes, the way Margaret's hand paused mid-motion as though she wanted to object but did not know how. She watched Garrett sitting calmly in the consultation room, his arm around the back of his daughter's chair, his face composed in the particular stillness of a man who had learned to absorb indignity without flinching. Vivian turned off the tablet, dropped it into her leather bag, and stepped out of the car. 20 minutes had passed when Preston returned to the consultation room. He sat down, adjusted his tie, and delivered his verdict with the rehearsed sympathy of a man who had practiced disappointing people so many times it no longer required effort. Mr. Nolan, I've consulted with our compliance team, and unfortunately, we're going to need additional time to verify your documents. Standard procedure for transactions of this magnitude could take 2 to 3 business days, possibly longer depending on the verification queue. Garrett studied Preston's face, the way he studied corroded pipes, looking for the weakness beneath the surface, the point where pressure would eventually cause a break. He had been reading people his entire adult life, and he knew when a man was hiding behind procedure to avoid doing his job. "Is there someone with higher authority I can speak to?" he asked. Preston straightened in his chair. The suggestion that his authority was insufficient seemed to land like a slap delivered in slow motion. His jaw tightened. His smile hardened into something closer to a mask. "I am the highest authority in this branch, Mr. Nolan." He paused, then added the word with deliberate, almost theatrical precision. "Sir." The word hung in the room like a wrong note held too long. Garrett recognized it immediately, the same hollow courtesy from the lobby, the same syllable wrapped around contempt and tied with a bow. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply gathered the documents, slid them back into the manila envelope, and stood. He lifted Rosie onto his hip with one arm, the way he had done every day since she was old enough to reach for him, and the motion was so practiced it looked like breathing. "My grandfather worked 40 years in oil fields, so his family would never have to beg for respect," Garrett said quietly. His voice carried no anger, only the low gravity of a truth that had cost someone a lifetime to earn. "I guess some things don't change." He walked out of the consultation room and through the lobby. The employees watched in the particular silence that falls over a room when everyone knows something wrong has happened and no one is willing to name it. Margaret pretended to organize a drawer. Kevin examined his shoes as though they had suddenly become fascinating. Dana watched Garrett carry Rosie past her window and felt something tighten behind her sternum, a pressure that had been building for 11 months and was now approaching the limit of what she could contain. Garrett reached the front entrance. The glass doors were 10 feet away. His truck was in the parking lot, dented and reliable, and there was a leaking water heater on Birch Street that still needed his attention before 5 o'clock. He shifted Rosie to his other hip and reached for the door handle. The door opened inward before he could push it outward. A woman stepped through sharp black suit, dark hair pulled back in a low knot, identification lanyard visible beneath her collar. She carried herself with the particular authority of someone who did not need to announce her title for people to understand it. Behind her, through the glass, Garrett could see the gray sedan parked near the entrance with its hazard lights still blinking. The woman stopped, looked at Garrett, then at Rosie, then back at Garrett. She did not step aside. She did not apologize for blocking his path. She simply stood there, reading the situation with eyes that missed nothing. From across the lobby, Preston Marsh saw her and felt the blood leave his face in a single cold rush. He knew exactly who she was. Every branch manager in the Southeastern Division knew Vivian Mercer, not by reputation alone but by the specific dread that accompanied an unannounced visit from someone who had the authority to end careers before lunch. Vivian Mercer extended her hand to Garrett first, not to Preston, who was now crossing the lobby with a smile that had appeared from nowhere like a magic trick performed badly. Not to Margaret or Kevin or any of the tellers who stood frozen behind the counter. She shook Garrett's hand with a firm, unhurried grip and said, "I'm Vivian Mercer, Regional Director for the Southeastern Division. I'd like to understand what happened here today." Preston arrived at her side, slightly breathless, his voice shifting to a register Garrett had not heard before. Higher, faster, eager in a way that bordered on desperate. "Miss Mercer, What a pleasant surprise. Everything here is perfectly under control. This gentleman was just— Vivian raised one finger without looking at Preston. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it silenced him as completely as if she had turned off his volume. She kept her eyes on Garrett. "Mr. Nolan, would you mind stepping back inside with me for a few minutes? I'd like to review your file, personally." Garrett studied her face. There was no condescension in it, no rehearsed smile, no performance. Just focused, unhurried attention, the kind that costs nothing to give and yet is so rarely offered that when it appears, it feels almost startling. He looked down at Rosie, who was already staring at Vivian's shoes, black patent leather, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the lobby lights. Rosie's mouth formed a small O of admiration. Garrett nodded. Inside the consultation room, Vivian asked Preston to present the complete client file. Preston launched into his account, and with each sentence the truth bent further from its original shape, like a wire being twisted until it no longer resembled what it had been. He described Garrett's documentation as incomplete. He described his own response as cautious, measured, and fully in compliance with bank protocol. He described the delay as a standard procedure that any responsible branch manager would implement for a transaction of this size. Vivian listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the desk, her expression neutral in the way that a calm sea is neutral, revealing nothing of what moves beneath the surface. When Preston finished, she asked for the documents. She opened the manila envelope and read each page with the focused precision of someone who had reviewed thousands of estate files and could identify a legitimate transfer, the way a jeweler identifies a real diamond quickly and without second-guessing. The notarization was current. The probate court order was valid and bore a judge's signature. The attorney's letter of instruction included a direct verification number. Every requirement had been met. There was nothing incomplete, nothing suspicious, nothing that warranted a 2-minute delay, let alone 3 days. She closed the envelope and looked at Preston. Her expression had shifted. The neutrality was gone, replaced by something colder, more precise, and infinitely more dangerous. The look of a person who has seen the full picture and is now deciding what to do about it. "Mr. Marsh, every document required for this transaction is present, properly executed, and in full compliance with federal banking regulations." She turned to Garrett. Her voice changed, not warmer exactly, but carrying a different weight, the weight of someone who understood that an apology, to mean anything at all, must be specific. "Mr. Nolan, I sincerely apologize for the delay and the experience you had today. This does not reflect the standards of this institution, and it should not have happened. Please allow me to personally handle your transaction." Rosie, still perched on Garrett's lap, looked up at Vivian with the unguarded directness that only a 6-year-old possesses and said, "You have really nice shoes." The tension in the room cracked like thin ice under sunlight. Vivian looked down at Rosie and, for the first time that entire day, smiled with her whole face, not the controlled, professional expression she wore in quarterly reviews and conference rooms, but something involuntary and undefended, the kind of smile that arrives before a person can stop it. She crouched down to Rosie's level, which was something Preston had not done once during the entire interaction and probably had never done for anyone under 4 feet tall. "Thank you, sweetheart, and I love your drawing. Who are the 2 people in the house?" Rosie pointed with her crayon. "That's Daddy, and that's me." Vivian nodded. Her smile softened but held. She straightened and gestured toward the hallway. "Mr. Nolan, let's move upstairs to the private office. I'll process everything myself." The private office on the 2nd floor had a wider window and a view of the old oak trees lining Federal Street, their leaves turning amber and copper in the late October light. Vivian logged into the executive terminal, entered the authorization codes, and began processing the wire transfer. While the system verified routing numbers and account credentials, the 2 of them talked. It was not the kind of conversation that typically occurs between a regional banking director and a walk-in customer. It happened because Vivian asked a question that had nothing to do with banking and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. "Tell me about your grandfather." Garrett leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, as though gathering the words from somewhere high and far away, a place where memories are stored not in order but in light. "Walter Eugene Nolan," he said, "was born in 1934 in a farmhouse outside Beaumont, Texas. He became a petroleum engineer not because he loved oil, but because he loved the earth, the layers beneath the surface, the hidden structures that held the world together. He spent 41 years mapping subsurface formations along the Gulf Coast. He survived 2 offshore rig fires, a Category 4 hurricane that flattened his neighborhood, and the death of his only daughter Garrett's mother, Ellen, when Garrett was 12 years old. Ellen had been diagnosed with an aggressive cancer that moved faster than any treatment could follow, and Walter had spent her final 3 months driving between Galveston and Houston every day, sleeping in hospital chairs. After Ellen died, Walter raised Garrett himself, making that 4-hour round trip every weekend to attend his grandson's school events and baseball games. He never missed one. Walter lived in the same 1,200-square-foot house until the day he died. He drove the same 1987 Ford pickup. He wore the same steel-toed boots until the soles gave out and then had them resoled rather than replaced. No one in Galveston knew Walter Nolan was wealthy because Walter Nolan did not believe that wealth was an interesting thing to know about a person. His will had contained a single instruction beyond the financial allocation. 7 words, handwritten on the final page. "Take care of Rosie, the rest will take care of itself." Vivian listened without interrupting, her hands still on the keyboard but no longer typing. When Garrett finished, the room was quiet except for the hum of the terminal and the muffled sound of traffic on Federal Street. After a moment, she spoke. "My father drove long-haul trucks out of Pittsburgh for 30 years. 18-wheelers, coast to coast, gone for weeks at a time. My mother worked the night shift at Allegheny General, came home at 6 in the morning and made us breakfast before school. I was the first person in my family to go to college." She paused. "My father used to tell me, before every first day of school, every job interview, every time I walked into a room where I felt like I didn't belong, he'd say, 'You don't need money to have standards, Vivi. Standards are free.'" Garrett looked at her across the desk. Something shifted in the air between them, subtle and unnamed, like the moment a room goes from cold to warm without anyone touching the thermostat. "Sounds like my grandfather," he said. The terminal chimed. Vivian turned to the screen and confirmed the wire transfer was complete. $8,200,000 had been successfully routed to Garrett's primary account, but the system had flagged an additional item, a separate trust account, established by Walter Nolan 3 years earlier under a different trustee, designated exclusively for the benefit of Rosemary June Nolan. The trust balance was $1,200,000. Garrett had not known it existed. His grandfather's attorney had not mentioned it during the probate process, likely because the trust operated independently and had only surfaced during the final estate reconciliation 2 weeks prior. Garrett stared at the screen. His jaw tightened. His eyes went red at the rims. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and breathed in slowly through his mouth, the way a man breathes when he is trying to hold himself together in front of someone he has known for less than 2 hours. "He thought of everything," he whispered. Rosie sat on the carpeted floor behind Garrett's chair, drawing a new picture with quiet concentration. She did not look up. She did not know that her great-grandfather, a man she remembered only as the one who smelled like coffee and always had butterscotch candies in his shirt pocket, and who let her sit on his lap while he read the newspaper aloud, in funny voices, had set aside more than $1 million to make sure she would be safe and educated and free long after he was gone. Vivian gave Garrett a moment. She did not fill the silence with platitudes or redirect the conversation to procedural matters. She simply waited. The way a person does when they understand that grief does not follow a schedule and cannot be hurried by good intentions. Vivian found Preston in the break room on the first floor, standing by the coffee machine with the studied casualness of a man who had been pacing for 40 minutes and was now pretending he had been calm the entire time. She closed the door behind her. The sound of the latch clicking into place made Preston flinch. She told him she had reviewed the surveillance footage before entering the building. She had watched him approach a customer in the lobby and suggest, within earshot of multiple employees and other customers, that the man had confused millions with thousands. She had observed him whispering to staff near the teller counter, describing a legitimate banking client as a potential fraud risk based on no evidence other than appearance. She had personally reviewed every document in the client's file and found them complete, current, and fully compliant. There was no compliance issue. There was no procedural justification for a delay of any duration. What had occurred in this branch today was not due diligence. It was discrimination. Preston attempted his defense. He described his actions as protective, an experienced manager exercising appropriate caution. He cited his 12 years in banking, his track record of catching fraudulent claims, his responsibility to shield the institution from risk. He spoke with the particular fluency of a man who had rehearsed his justification so many times they had hardened into something he mistook for truth. Vivian let him finish. She always let people finish. It was a habit she had developed early in her career. Let them talk until they run out of rope, and they will inevitably tie the knot themselves. When Preston stopped, she spoke with the measured clarity of someone delivering a verdict that had already been decided. "You didn't protect the bank, Mr. Marsh. You humiliated a grieving father in front of his 6-year-old daughter because he was wearing work boots and a denim jacket. That man lost his grandfather 6 months ago. He came here today to fulfill a dying wish, and you treated him like a criminal." She informed Preston that he was suspended, effective immediately, pending a formal, internal investigation. The investigation would examine not only today's incident but the full pattern of complaints that had triggered her visit. She mentioned the specific number 7 formal complaints in the last quarter. Depending on the findings, the outcome would likely include termination and a report to the Regional Compliance Board. Preston set down his coffee cup. His hand was not steady. He said nothing. There was a knock at the break room door. Dana Reeves stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression set with the particular resolve of someone who has been quiet for too long and has made a decision that cannot be unmade. She said she wanted to file a formal statement. She described 3 previous incidents in which Preston had dismissed or denied service to customers based on their appearance, an elderly woman turned away with a valid check, a young couple driven out during a mortgage application, a veteran whose pension transfer had been deliberately delayed. Dana had dates, names, and detailed descriptions written in a notebook she had kept in her desk drawer since her 3rd week at the branch, when she first realized that what she was witnessing was not caution but cruelty. Vivian thanked her. She asked Dana to submit the written statement before the end of the business day and assured her that her account would be included in the formal review. Dana nodded once, looked briefly at Preston, and left. Vivian picked up her bag, looked at Preston one final time. He was staring at the floor with the hollowed expression of a man watching his own reflection disappear, and walked out. Downstairs, Garrett sat in the lobby with Rosie asleep on his shoulder. Her crayon drawing rested on the chair beside him, the small house, the 2 figures, the sun, the flowers. He stared at it the way a man stares at something that is both perfectly simple and completely unbearable. He thought about Rachel, about the last Tuesday morning she had walked out the front door, car keys in hand, calling over her shoulder that she would be back before dinner. A delivery truck had run a red light on Maple Avenue at 4:17 in the afternoon. The hospital had called at 4:42. Garrett had been under a kitchen sink on the other side of town when his phone rang, and by the time he arrived at the emergency room, still in his work clothes, the doctors were already speaking in past tense. He thought about Walter. About the phone call at 5 in the morning, Walter's voice breaking for the first and only time Garrett had ever heard it break. About Walter, arriving 7 hours later, having driven straight through without stopping, his boots muddy, his face gray but his arms steady. Walter had slept on Garrett's couch for 3 weeks. He had held Rosie every night while Garrett sat in the garage with the lights off, learning that grief was not a wave but an ocean, something you did not cross but simply lived inside. Walter had never said it would be okay. He had simply shown up, morning after morning, until Garrett remembered how to stand. Vivian came down the stairs and crossed the lobby. She sat in the chair beside Garrett, careful not to disturb Rosie. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon light came through the tall lobby windows and laid itself across the marble floor, in long, quiet shapes, the color of warm honey. "Your grandfather sounds like he was an extraordinary man," Vivian said softly. Garrett nodded, his hand resting gently on Rosie's back. "He was. He just never needed anyone to know it." They sat there for another minute, two people in a bank lobby connected by something that had nothing to do with money. Vivian looked at the sleeping child on Garrett's shoulder and thought about the life she had built: the corner office, the regional title, the apartment in Charlotte where she ate dinner alone most nights with a cat named Oliver as her only company. She thought about her ex-husband's words, "I feel like I'm married to a title, not a person." Sitting here now, watching a man in work boots hold his daughter as though she were more valuable than anything a bank could hold, Vivian felt something shift quietly in her chest, a small rearrangement of priorities she had kept in the wrong order for too long. Vivian asked Garrett what he planned to do with the inheritance. He did not answer immediately. He shifted Rosie gently on his shoulder and looked through the window at the parking lot, where his truck sat between two polished sedans like a draft horse standing among thoroughbreds. "Rosie's trust is already set up," he said, "so her future is covered. I need to fix the roof. It's been leaking since March, and I've been patching it with tarps and prayers." A small smile crossed his face, then faded. "And I want to set up a fund, something small, something local, for single-parent families who need help with rent or repairs when things go sideways. There are a lot of people in this town who are one broken furnace or one car transmission away from a really bad month. I know because I've been in their kitchens, fixing their pipes, and I've seen what they're dealing with." Vivian studied his face. In 15 years of private banking, she had processed windfalls for clients who spent their first conversation talking about second homes, European vacations, and offshore accounts. She had never, not once, heard someone describe $8 million without mentioning a single thing for themselves. "And nothing for you?" she asked. Garrett smiled. It was the first full, unguarded smile she had seen from him all day, and it changed his entire face, softened the lines around his eyes, lifted the weight that seemed to live permanently in his jaw. "Maybe a new pair of boots," he said. Vivian reached into her bag and handed him a business card. "If you need any help setting up the community fund, or if you want guidance on the trust documents, call me directly. Not the branch number. My personal line." Garrett took the card, studied it for a moment, and slipped it into the pocket of his denim jacket. "Thank you, Miss Mercer." "Vivian," she corrected. He met her eyes. "Thank you, Vivian." Rosie stirred on his shoulder, opened one eye, saw Vivian, and gave a slow, sleepy wave with fingers still stained faintly with crayon. Vivian waved back. Garrett stood, tucked the manila envelope under his arm, settled Rosie against his chest, and walked toward the door. Vivian watched them cross the lobby, a man in work boots carrying his daughter with one arm and a grandfather's legacy with the other, walking the same way he had walked in, without hurry, without show, without apology. 1 week later, Garrett returned to Ridgemont Federal to sign the final paperwork for Rosie's trust. The atmosphere in the branch had shifted in ways both visible and invisible. Dana Reeves met him at the front door with a genuine smile and a paper cup of coffee from the cafe across the street. The lobby felt different, lighter, as though someone had opened a window that had been painted shut for years. Preston Marsh's nameplate had been removed from the corner office. The door was closed. Garrett still wore his flannel shirt and boots. He had not bought new ones. Vivian handled the trust documents personally, walking Garrett through each clause with care. She then introduced him to two wealth management advisors who spoke to him not as a windfall recipient, but as a client whose intentions they respected. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Vivian asked Garrett if he had time for a cup of coffee. They walked across the street to a small cafe called Merriweather's, a place with mismatched wooden chairs and a chalkboard menu that the owner rewrote every morning in colorful chalk. Rosie claimed a corner table and spread out her crayons like a painter setting up a studio. Garrett and Vivian sat by the window with 2 cups of black coffee and talked the way people talk when the professional scaffolding has been removed, and all that remains is who they actually are. Vivian told him about her divorce 2 years earlier. Her husband, Paul, a high school English teacher, had been patient through the late nights, the canceled vacations, the weekends spent on conference calls. Eventually, he had sat her down and said, with more sadness than anger, that he felt like he was married to a job title rather than a person. She had not fought the divorce. She had not known how to argue with something that was true. Garrett listened. He did not offer advice or try to fix anything. He simply listened with his full attention, the way Walter had taught him, not with the goal of responding, but with the goal of understanding. Walter used to say that most problems in the world got smaller if you just let someone finish talking without rushing to fill the silence. Rosie finished her drawing and walked to the table, holding it with both hands. She presented it to Vivian with the solemnity of a diplomat presenting a treaty. It was another house, triangular roof, flowers, sun, but this time, inside the house, there were 3 figures, one tall, one short, and one in between. "This one has 3 people," Rosie announced. "The tall one is you." Vivian took the drawing carefully, holding it by the edges as though it were made of something that could shatter. Her hand trembled, just barely, just enough for Garrett to notice. She looked at Rosie, then at Garrett, then at the 3 crayon figures standing together inside a house that did not exist yet but somehow already felt real. "Thank you, Rosie," she said. "I'll keep this forever." Garrett's phone buzzed on the table. A call from his grandfather's attorney in Houston. The attorney apologized during the final inventory of Walter's safe deposit box at the Galveston Bank. They had discovered a sealed envelope tucked behind a stack of old mineral rights certificates. It was addressed to Garrett in Walter's handwriting and had been overlooked during the initial probate process. The envelope was being sent by certified mail and would arrive within 2 days. Garrett hung up and stared at the phone on the table. Rosie tugged his sleeve and asked if she could have a cookie. He ordered her 1 chocolate chip, the size of her face. He did not mention the letter to Vivian. Some things from Walter still belonged only to the 2 of them. 2 evenings later, after Rosie had brushed her teeth, read 2 pages of a picture book about a rabbit who wanted to be an astronaut, and fallen asleep clutching a stuffed animal named Pickles, Garrett sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. The only light came from the fixture above the stove, casting a warm circle on the laminate countertop and the sealed envelope that lay in its center. He opened it carefully. The paper inside was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting shaky but deliberate, each letter formed with the concentration of a man whose hands had once steadied drilling equipment in 100-mile-an-hour winds and now struggled to hold a pen. The letter began with the night Garrett was born. Walter wrote that he had driven 4 hours through a thunderstorm to reach the hospital in Houston, that he had arrived with mud on his boots and rain soaking through his jacket, and that a nurse had tried to make him wait in the lobby until his daughter Ellen had shouted from the delivery room that if her father was not standing beside her in 30 seconds, she would get up and have the baby in the parking lot. Walter wrote that he had held Garrett for the first time at 3:11 in the morning, and that the boy had wrapped his entire fist around Walter's index finger and held on for 11 minutes without letting go. He wrote about Ellen, about the morning she did not wake up when Garrett was 12, about driving to Houston that day and sitting on the porch of her house for an hour before he could bring himself to open the front door, about finding 12-year-old Garrett in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, trying to make scrambled eggs because he did not know what else to do, and realizing in that moment that grief was not something a person could carry alone, no matter how strong they believed themselves to be. The final paragraph was written in slightly steadier handwriting, as though Walter had gathered every remaining ounce of steadiness in his body for these last lines. You became the man I always hoped you'd be, not because of what you have, but because of how you love. Tell Rosie her great-grandpa is watching. Garrett pressed his palms flat against the kitchen table and breathed. Tears ran down his face silently, dropping onto the wood in small dark circles. He looked up at the wall above the stove. Rachel's photograph hung there, the one from their wedding, where she was laughing at something he had whispered during the vows. Her head thrown back, her eyes closed, her joy so complete it seemed to radiate beyond the frame. Beside it, a photograph of Walter holding newborn Rosie in the hospital, grinning wider than Garrett had ever seen him grin, his weathered hands cradling her as gently as if she were made of light. And next to that, taped to the wall with a piece of Scotch tape already curling at the edges, Rosie's newest drawing the house with 3 people inside. The next morning, Garrett's phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message from Vivian, sent at 7:45. Would Rosie like to go to the zoo this Saturday? I have extra tickets. Absolutely no pressure. Garrett read it twice. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the photograph of Rachel on the wall. Then he typed, "She'd love that, so would I." He set the phone down, walked to the kitchen, and carefully placed Walter's letter inside a simple wooden frame he had picked up from the hardware store the day before, between a box of pipe fittings and a roll of Teflon tape. He hung the frame on the wall beside the photographs and the drawing, then stepped back and looked at all of it together, Rachel laughing. Walter holding Rosie, and 3 crayon figures, standing in a house full of flowers and sunlight. Then he pulled on his jacket, laced his boots, grabbed the toolbox from the garage, and drove to Birch Street, where a water heater had been leaking since Monday and a family was waiting for hot water. $8 million had changed the numbers in his bank account. It had not changed the man who showed up.